No. Hi, I'm Sharon Wolfgang. Invited Taryn and get to introduce her. So thanks for coming today. Taryn Morrissey is an associate professor at the School of Public Affairs at American University. She's also a non-resident fellow at the Urban Institute and a commissioner on the Washington, D.C. Office of the State Superintendent on Education's Healthy Youth and Schools Commission. And Taryn brings a really unique, I think, set of skills and background experiences, both in terms of her work in policy, and she brings that very much to her academic scholarship. So prior to joining the faculty at AU, Taryn was the health policy advisor on the staff of the U.S. Senate Health Committee, first for Senator Ed Kennedy and then for Senator Tom Harkin. And she worked primarily on federal health reform legislation, child and maternal health and workforce issues. And she also began her career as a fellow for the American Association of the Advancement of Science and the Society for Research in Child Development. And she's currently an interdisciplinary research leader awardee of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. So she has a lot more that I could say, but I don't want to take too much of her time. I'll just also say that Taryn has been very productive in her scholarship as well and published across a wide range of disciplines. And so I think her work really will be of interest to many of us who are here who come from very different disciplines. So thanks, Taryn, for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. See if I can make this work. And thank you for a very warm welcome and for having me here today and joining me here. I know you're all extremely busy. So my work is largely focused, my interest on how income affects, or income disparities in health, children's achievement, and other kinds of outcomes. And this paper is somewhat of a different spin on that. I'm looking at how income, or the influx of income, affects one potential mechanism underlying income disparities, particularly parent-child time use. And I should say I'm a psychologist by training, but I'm in a policy department, so I'm used to people interrupting with questions or clarifying or otherwise, so please feel free. And this is a work in progress too, so I look forward to your comments. So as I mentioned, the motivator for this paper are income disparities in achievement. This figure is from Sean Reardon's work. He's at the Stanford School of Education, showing scores in math is on the right, reading is on the left, over time. So the first measure is in 1970 through 2010. So the top bar, which I think is red, although you can't quite see the red, there are representative children's scores from households with incomes at the 90th percentile. The middle are children from the 50th percentile of income, and the bottom line, the green line, are children from households with incomes at the 10th percentile. And so you can see a couple things here, right? There are wide income disparities in test scores, and that's been the case since we started measuring these age scores back in the 1970s. Another take-home point is that they're widening over time. We've seen racial achievement scores or the racial achievement gap narrowing over time, but income achievement has widened. And then also, this is not just a problem of low-income kids being different from everyone else. This is really a problem of high-income kids kind of pulling away, as well as some evidence for middle-income kids also doing better, but still not as good. They can't quite close that gap, right? So scores have increased over time for everybody. Everybody's doing better in theory than their peers were back in the past, but these gaps have been maintained. So one question for research is, well, when you give people money, does this change achievement? And indeed, it does appear that this is true. We know from largely quasi-experimental, but some experimental research showing that improved income leads to improved academic outcomes from within child fixed effects models, and also some of the welfare experiments back in the 1990s. So effect sizes are about on short-term test scores about 3 to 6% of a standard deviation from $1,000, we should say. Now the earned income tax credit, which I'll talk a little bit more, is a refundable tax credit that essentially provides an influx of funds to low-income families, low-income working families, unfortunately. And this has been exploited, expansions in the earned income tax credit have been exploited to look at how income affects a range of outcomes, including prenatal, birth, infant, and adult health outcomes, as well as within home quality measures, which is what the home measures as behavioral outcomes. So there's evidence that income does have short-term as well as long-term improvements, results in long-term improvements in children's outcomes as well as the within home experiences. So there's several ways by which income may affect achievement in particular. One is from improved household resources. More income, you can provide food, more nutritious food, for example. You can purchase health care more so. This could lead to improved child health, which is associated with improved child achievement. You could buy books, for example, more materials that can improve achievement as well. Improved income can also change children's experiences and the kinds of activities, the types and number of activities that they do, like tutoring or violin lessons, higher quality childcare, higher quality K-12 education as well. And then finally, it may also change the nature of parent-child time. With more income, parents could outsource tasks that they'd rather not do potentially, like cooking. They may eat out more, thus allowing for more time interacting with children, cleaning, or commute time in particular. We know that with more resources, particularly from EITC refunds, families buy cars. And so with a more reliable car, you're not taking the bus and spending a lot of time commuting or dealing with a broke down car, hopefully. So I'm focused on this last mechanism, how income improves or changes the nature, the quality and quantity of parent-child time. Just like with, we know that there are income disparities in children's scores. We know that there are income and socioeconomic disparities in how parents and children spend their time. Recent work suggests that these gaps have narrowed over the last few decades in some measures. Like families across the income spectrum are more likely to take their kids to the library quite often. There's not a lot of income disparities in that, but others have widened. So again, while all families are more likely to report reading to their children, their higher income families are doing so at much higher rates. So the gap has widened, including teaching them numbers. And I'm specifically referring to young kids, pre-kindergarten kids. But to date, no experimental or quasi-experimental research has examined how income affects parent-child time, at least that's what I'm aware of. And it's we know that parent-child time varies by family structure, the age of the child, and parent gender. And so I'm particularly interested in how income affects parent-child time, and then how these family and child characteristics may, how these relationships may differ by these characteristics. So the Earned Income Tax Credit is a federal policy designed to put money in the hands of low-income families in particular. It touches a lot of Americans. This map is from the Brookings Institution. It shows the share of taxpayers at each county that receives EITC. And these darker areas have 60% or more taxpayers receive an Earned Income Tax Credit. So it's quite far-reaching. It's only second to SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assurance Assistance Program, formerly known as food stamps, in terms of dollars spent and number of families impacted. So it's a really vital safety net program. Particularly as the discussion in politics and policy has really focused on increased reliance on work, the EITC has kind of enjoyed this bipartisan support and expansions. It's designed as a work incentive. So it's unlike something like Medicaid or SNAP, where you reach a certain income threshold and then your benefits just go away. EITC phases in and phases out. So it's really designed to be a work incentive and has a smooth phase out, rather than a cliff effect. It's refundable, which is important. So if a low-income family has no tax liability, they still can benefit from the tax credit. Most tax credits, like the child and dependent care tax credit in our federal system, is not refundable, and thus the poorest families don't benefit from it. But this one is. So in 2016, over 27 million workers and families received more than 67 billion in EITC benefits. I think in 2017, about 70 billion was spent on SNAPs as a point of comparison. Average refund is quite sizable, so $2,500 almost, and that can change behavior, particularly when your income might hover around the poverty level or 150% of the poverty level. Because EITC doesn't require going to a social welfare office or applying for it, there's not a stigma associated with it, it's not obvious that one is using SNAP to pay for food, for example. EITC reaches a lot of people who are eligible, so about 80% of those eligible receive EITC, which is a higher rate than who participates in SNAP or other kinds of public assistance. We know from the empirical research that it does indeed increase household income, and that refunds are typically received in lump sum funds like anybody receives a tax refund. It's usually received after you file your taxes as one lump sum during tax time. And so families use this to pay back bills or or for big purchases, particularly in buying vehicles. The seasonality of EITC, this kind of one time or once a year lump sum payment, is what I exploit. It's been exploited in some other research looking at health, particularly child and adult health. But it provides this source of variation over the course of the year. You receive tax refund in February or March and don't the other times of the year. There's a lot of work on EITC and achievement or birth weight and other kinds of outcomes has exploited variation in the program from the 1990s. EITC was expanded quite a bit then. It's really been pretty consistent over the course of the last 20 or so years. There was a bump for large families in the rate in the FARA, the 2009 stimulus bill. But relatively, it's been pretty consistent. And some states have their own EITCs, and that has changed, but the federal one is relatively similar to what it has been. So this is from one of those papers that I mentioned looking at, looking at EITC and short-term effects on adult health. So this shows the distribution of EITC refund disbursements by month. And you can see about 80% received their refunds in March or February, another 10% in April, and refunds are relatively not common in other times of the year. If you're expecting a big refund, you're probably going to file your taxes as soon as you get your W-2, presumably.
Can you tell us what is the main eligibility criteria for EITC?
Sure. So you have to be working. That's key. SNAP, you can, there's certain requirements, but most other public assistance isn't necessarily attached to work. With EITC, you most certainly have to be working. The income cap is about $60,000 per household, but again, the benefits go up to a maximum point and fade away. Households with children get higher rates, so childless adults don't always benefit from EITC, or they do so much less consistently. So children under 18, and that's the population I focus on now. So it's really designed for working households with children under 18. So I focus on two research questions here. I'm interested in how EITC receipt affects short-term parent-child time use. So the influx of income during March or February, how that affects, how that has immediate effects on parent-child time use. And I suspect that it's associated with increased parent-child time due to these substitution effects, as well as maybe less time spent commuting. Also, with more income, you're less stressed, right, as a parent. And so the data that I get, and I'll talk about more, the data that I use for this, it only assesses the quality or the quantity of time. It doesn't assess the emotional valence of that time, which I think is an important omission. But if one is less stressed, you might potentially be more likely to engage in enriching activities as opposed to just doing something else to alleviate their stress. So as I mentioned, the EITC is designed to be a work incentive because up to a certain point, with every dollar you earn, you get something on top of it. And it is shown to be, in the long term, a work incentive. Short-term effects of the refund receipt are not as clear. We know from other work that the influx of money could lead to short-term decreases in work. As you have more money in your pocket, you don't necessarily have to take on that second shift, for example. So you might expect if a parent is working more, they may have less time to spend with their child. That could decrease parent-child time. On the other hand, from work in on time use, we know that while mothers' labor force participation has dramatically increased over the last few decades, mothers are still spending the same amount of time, and sometimes they get even more time with their children. So they sacrifice things like sleep and leisure to spend time with their children as well as work. And so this pattern could hold true here. Alternatively, it could be a work disincentive in the short term, allowing for more parent-child time. And then I'm also interested in the heterogeneous effects by the age of the child, family structure, marital status particularly, and parent gender. I hypothesize that effects will be stronger among households with young children, particularly those under 6, in unmarried households and for mothers compared to older children or fathers. And I think the EITC, much of its behavioral effects have been found for single mothers in particular. So I used data from the American Time Use Survey, merged with the current population survey. The ATUS is a subsample of CPS, and it's a cross-sectional, nationally representative study from began in 2003, and it's been done consistently through 2017. It continues to be done, but 2017 data are the latest available. And it's a retrospective 24-hour diary of the day before. So people are asked in 15-minute increments, what were you doing and with whom were you with? And only primary activities are collected, so keep that in mind when I talk about the descriptives. Secondary activities, like if you were driving and also talking on the phone would not be collected. There's about almost 200,000 observations, so these are individual respondents because it's cross-sectional, about half of whom live with one or more children under 18. Unfortunately, the CPS or the ATUS do not observe EITC receipt, but I use the National Bureau of Economic Research's TaxSim program to predict EITC refund amounts. And this is predicted from characteristics like income or from household structure, state of residence, etc. So it's again, it's a predicted amount. It's not observed, but it's also not self-reported. And these predicted EITC refunds range from $0 to almost $6,000, and about 23% of respondents with children were predicted to receive EITC, which maps on relatively similar to national figures.
But in fact, you predict about 21% of them actually got 0, right?
21% of.
Well, I mean, did you say that the people who qualify for it, 79% get it?
That's right.
Which means 21% don't.
21, yes, so 21%, yeah, yes. No, that's true. So this is eligible, right? So this is predicted eligibility, and certainly, yeah, receipt is not 100%. Right?
So I mean, in some sense, if you find an effect, it's biased downwards.
That's true, yeah. Yes, thank you. I link these using state identifiers which are available in the ATUS and CPS. I link it with annual state level data from the University of Kentucky Center for Poverty Research, their national welfare database. They have information on state level poverty rates and political and economic factors. So to control for time variable characteristics. So I use a difference in differences approach, where Y is a measure of parent-child time, and I define it in 2 different ways. First, a binary measure of whether any time was spent in a specific activity, and then a continuous measure of the total number of minutes. And I do this partially because it may not be particularly relevant if somebody reads to a child 25 minutes or 21 minutes, but it may have more impact on a parent reads to a child or not. The binary measure is important for children's development and family well-being. I define tax time as February or March. This is when the vast majority of people who receive the ITC receive their refunds compared to the other 10 months of the year. EITC is defined as a respondent predicted to receive a refund of $1,000 or more. So I wanted a threshold that would really change behavior, whereas $200 is nice to have, particularly if you're low income. It's not quite as much of an effect as $1,000. Compared to those who are predicted to receive zero EITC. And it's about 1/3 of my sample that were predicted to receive EITC that were predicted to receive refunds less than $1,000. So I'm not throwing out a lot of people, but just to be aware. The sample I limit to respondents who have less than a college degree, so less than a 4-year college degree. So there are some people with some college or high school degree, but not a high school degree, but who have 1 or more children. So these are less educated households with children in the entire sample. So the control group represents essentially higher income, less educated households with children or respondents with children. I control for a range of households, respondent and state characteristics, as well as state, month, and year fixed effects, and cluster errors at the state. And then I also run separate models on subsamples to test heterogeneity. So I end up with an analysis sample of 42,672 respondents. These are the control variables, including gender, marital status, education. Again, these are all less than college, so I'm controlling for a high school degree or some college. And then state level factors like population, unemployment rate, and political control that might vary over time, and different kinds of public assistance could vary within state. This is sample background characteristics, largely on the control variables. So the first column are the treatment group, so those predicted to receive EITC, again, of $1,000 or more. The second column is the control group, and then the third column is the total sample. You can see that among the treatment group, the average EITC refund amount was about $3,300. There's a big standard deviation, but these are pretty large influxes of cash in households. About 17% were interviewed during tax time, the rest being at other times of the year. And the treatment and control groups varied quite a lot in background characteristics, most of which you wouldn't be surprised given how they were formed. So one is household employment. So about half of respondents in the treatment group were employed, meaning there was some sort of combination of employment, I should say, across the year to be predicted to receive EITC. But at that time, and then with higher rates in the control group, they're higher income. You can see the income characteristics lower too. The control group also tended to be slightly more educated, and there were racial and ethnic differences as well. There were no differences in marital status, rates of being married, or in living in a metropolitan area or otherwise. This table shows dependent variables. Again, I looked at a binary measure of if a respondent reported doing any sort of activity in a day, and then a continuous measure of number of minutes. The treatment group is the first column, control group, and then the total sample. And you can see quite a few descriptive differences in time use as well. So the first row are total time with all children. That's different than the second row of total time with household children. So this could be respondents spending time with children that live in another household, so non-resident parents, for example. Or a person spending time with a niece and nephew or neighbor's children. So in general, the treatment group spends more time with children than the control group, and the control group is working more. again, is kind of in line with how these groups were formed. Now
What's the time period? This is time per week, per day?
oh, this is per day, thank you. So these are number of minutes per day. Yeah, this is about, this is from the 24-hour time diary report. So somebody reported they were working from 9 to 5, this would be 8 hours times 60 minutes.
It's 24 hours, so does that include sleeping? So
It
if they're
does.
sleeping at home with their children, that's, okay, so it's high numbers.
Exactly, no, it's important clarification. So spending time with family, for example. So who was with you when you were sleeping? So that includes sleeping time. The enrichment, variable, so time spent in enriching activities is a sum of these activities below it. So this is helping children with homework, this is reading to children, attending events, activities, talking with children. Again, keep in mind, parents are talking to their kids more than 3 minutes a day. This is talking as a primary activity, right? So if you're talking to your child while you're driving somewhere, that's not recorded. So take that with a grain of salt. And playing or watching sports with children as well. So the treatment group, those EITC receivers, are spending also more time in enriching activities with their children. But as a percentage of their total time with household children, it's less than the control group. So it's about 10% of their time with household children is spent in these enriching activities versus 12% for the control group.
So in the American Family Survey, the respondents continuously record how they're spending their time. At the end of the day, do they go back to the diary or how does it work?
It's usually a phone survey asking about the day before. So it's by memory. So when did you wake up? When did you eat breakfast? Then what did you do? Then what did you do is kind of the prompting. So it does rely on people reporting accurately transitions, particularly among activities. The other downside to the ATUS is work is a block of time. It doesn't count activities done at work necessarily. So if you took a break and you called your spouse, that would be counted, but not necessarily if having a lunch meeting would be counted as eating. So that's also important to think about when you interpret results from the ATUS.
These are the mothers or fathers, or is that a combination of?
It's a combination.
So in fact, if the mothers spend more time than father usually for the reading and children, so actually quite substantially different, that. So, I mean, but your analysis will be using this combined.
I do separate gender in one analysis, but yeah, the others are combined. So I think more income might affect mothers' behavior more, whereas they might be more likely to take fewer shifts and then spend their time with children in the face of more income, whereas dads are still maybe more likely to maintain their work activities. So that's why I separate out the gender. And your time use varies quite a bit.
And can you know if it's weekend or not weekend, or that can be accounted for? Yeah.
So I weight all these in the ways they account for weekend or not weekend. Yeah. And these are averaged across. These are seasonal variations, right? Because I rely on seasonal variation and EITC receipt as my source of income variation. So this shows the percent of any time with children on the left, and then total time with children on the right. The red line are the treatment groups, so those predicted to receive EITC $1,000 or more. The blue line are the control group. Now the y-axes are not don't start at 0. So the differences are exaggerated, so keep that in mind. But we do see across the year that the treatment group is more likely to continue to spend more time with all children than the control group. And there's seasonal variation. Some that you might expect some that you might not. And in July, for example, or in June, May and June, which might be summer, families are spending more time with all children. These are more pronounced, somewhat. The summer, spending any time with household children goes up. Although the differences are quite consistent. So this is time spent with family. This varies quite a bit. It's the lowest during tax season, so February, March, and April, and much more higher in August and September. All of my dependent variables have something to do with children. So people can report that they're reading, but if the child isn't with them, I don't include that in dependent characteristic. But time with family could be time with a spouse, could be time with a brother or sister. It doesn't necessarily have to be with the child. Same thing with working, which I'll show too. Now this enriching activities, which is the sum of those characteristics that I mentioned, show relatively strong seasonal variation that seem to be in parallel with both groups with some noise. So it's lowest in terms of continuous time in April and September. September is when kids go back to school, so parents may decrease their time reading to kids, or whereas in June or July, families are generally spending more time together. And this is caring for children, which involves like physical care, changing diapers for young kids, bathing them, etc., which changes with child age. All of the nature of these characteristics change with child age. You're not helping an infant with homework, for example, so that's the sum. And then working, as you might expect, shows seasonal variation as well that are importantly different between the treatment and controls. I'll talk more about that, why other ways to find this. So this is the main models. Again, this combines males and females, as well as married and unmarried household. Each column is a separate regression model with a dependent variable listed on top. And these are the binary measures. So the parameter of interest is this interaction between the EITC refund receipt and tax time. And you can see there are two significant findings. One is that, surprisingly, in contrast to my hypotheses, that respondents report that they are less likely to engage in any enriching activities, or less likely to care for children during tax time relative to other years among EITC receivers, so relative to non-EITC receivers. And this is about 3.8 percentage points for enriching activities, about 3.4 percentage points for caring. So not insubstantial effects when you consider the baseline for that about 21% of respondents report any enriching time. And with the continuous measures, you can see that respondents are less likely to report engaging in any enriching activities during tax time, EITC receivers, and they also spend less time engaged in these activities for about 5 minutes. Now I'm not so trustful of these enriching results, so I don't want anybody to walk away with saying giving families money is going to decrease their quality time spent with kids. So just like I said that. Now, so these are, sorry for the format. These figures show separate analyses by child age. It's small, but so the first column under each dependent variable are respondents with the youngest child under age 6, and the second column are where the youngest child in the household is between 6 and 18 years old. We see that this enriching effect is driven by households with school-age children, not by young children. And this is true for a continuous amount of time. What's interesting here is there's for total time spent working, respondents with young children report EITC respondents with young children report spending more time working during tax time relative to other times. You know, I think this potentially could be that families with young children require childcare, right? Their kid is not in school yet, which 6 to 18, they're attending school in February, March, hopefully. And so potentially with more money in your pocket, you can purchase childcare and take on those shifts. Although the seasonal patterns and differences in work raise concerns for this too. These next set of figures shows differences by respondent gender. There's males in the first column and then males in the second column under each dependent variable. You can see the binary dependent variables. Here we see any household children. Females are increasing their amount of time with children living in their household, or their likelihood of spending any time with children. Now, this likelihood is already pretty high. Moms spend time with their kids in a given day. So it's a relatively small effect, but it is significant. And it's males that appear to be driving this effect on enriching time. I should preface this with EITC refunds don't seem to have huge effects on time use, right? I mean, the vast majority of these effects are not significant. This is the continuous dependent variables separated by gender. We see males decreasing their amount of time spent with household children. The coefficient is positive, but it's only marginally statistically significant for women. And then there's this decrease in enrichment time. And then finally, I separated results for analyses for married and unmarried respondents. And you see that unmarried respondents, well, both married and unmarried report are less likely to engage in enriching activities. It's only marginally significant for married households. And then anytime caring for children, again, this is like physical care and looking after as a primary activity. Married respondents were less likely to do that on a given day during tax time. And then for the continuous outcomes, we don't see a whole lot of differences in family structure, except with unmarried respondents. Again, these are males and females, but unmarried respondents reporting more time with all children. So this is similar to females, and then unmarried respondents report more time spent with children. So that was a lot of tables, but to sum it up, during tax time, relative to the control group, EITC receivers seem to, particularly the parents of young children, increase their time spent working. Parents of school-age children decrease enriching time. Males appear to be driving this decreasing enriching time, whereas females increase time with children. Unmarried parents in particular increase time with all children but have a lower likelihood of engaging in any enrichment time. And married parents are less likely to spend any time caring for their children. So I did a range of sensitivity analyses. First, because we know that EITC is particularly important to the incomes of single mothers and has behavioral effects on single mothers from previous research, I looked at a subsample of unmarried female participants or respondents. And essentially the effects were similar to those for females and those for unmarried, but stronger. So EITC receivers showed about a 5 percentage point increase in their likelihood of spending any time with household children. And they increased total time by quite a bit, about 41 minutes, and with family members as well. So they seem to be, in theory at least, taking the increased refunds and potentially doing something to substitute or taking on fewer work shifts, although there were work effects, so not necessarily working less. Although I'm interested to see if they're working at different times. And one of the follow-ups to this is looking at start and stop times of work. Particularly if you have more money, you're less likely to work in the graveyard shift, for example. Because people,
interrupt, but so I'm not an economist, maybe I'm not using these words right, but,
I'm not either.
okay. I know, because I've sat here over many years, economists love shocks. They love shocks. Love shocks, they go around looking for shocks. Really, that's what an economist is, somebody who's looking for a shock. But there's no shock here. People know this is coming in some sense, unless it's their first time.
Yeah.
So here's another thing I picked up from the economists, like income smoothing. In some sense, people know I get a bonus at Christmas, I don't draw a summer salary. The point is that people are doing these kinds of smoothings, and you don't really even have to be an economist to believe it's possibly true. In which case, I'm not so surprised that these aren't working like the shocks, like you won the lottery, your parent died, whatever, economists are running around trying to grab on. Sorry to interrupt like that, but
No, it's true. I think there are a couple of potential responses. There's one that are people smoothing over behavior in anticipation of EITC receipt? One is, do they know and are they accurate predictors of their refund size? I'm not sure. Yeah, I think they're relatively consistent over time. So one's refund size the previous year could be very predictive. The next year, although we know a lot of work that Sharon and others have done, that income instability is particularly important and prevalent among this sort of low-wage workers. So they may not, the previous year's refund may not be predictive of this year's refund, and they may not have a good sense of what they're going to get. It also depends on whether people aren't able to necessarily smooth over their time use research in anticipation, right? That it is the actual money that changes time use, not just the anticipation that I'm going to have that check. So that's something I don't really know, but it's a really good point.
No, I have a question about time use data that I'm not familiar with, but where do you have, like for instance, watching TV? Or, do people really, what are the categories that, if you think about, you have 24 hours in a day, and then time use is really how you spend it. And I wonder if, you look at amount of time, but you can also think about proportion of the whole day or so I wonder if why are these mutually exclusive, for instance, total time with family and enrichment with the kids? Do they overlap, or these are separate things? And so that can affect how, these impacts. Basically, people have to allocate between these different things. So I wonder to what extent you can just look at one. Yeah.
Right. That's a great point. I came at it from I'm a developmental psychologist, so I'm thinking about the child's perspective. And frankly, what I would love is child level time use. And I'll get to that. But I think from a child's point of view, the amount of time and whether a family, a parent does it or not is important. But I think the proportion is also looking at it from a framework of choice, that the respondent is choosing within a 24-hour constraint what they're doing. And I started looking at the percentage of total time with children that is spent in these enriching activities. I haven't run it on the different groups yet, but I think that is an important area to look at, because you're right, it's about choices, yeah.
Yeah, the problem in other areas, when you go with proportions, it just reduces the variation so much that it becomes more difficult to find these effects, but I understand. But something I was just thinking about, whether you have a fixed total amount or something like that.
Yeah, I haven't mapped out the percentage over the course of the year too, but it may have less seasonal variation, which I think would be good to try to detect some sort of effect of EITC, because you do see families spend more time with their kids in the summer, at least school age kids. And, so yeah, I do think I'm going to work more on that proportion. It's between different people who are interviewed at different time points. So they're different people. So everybody receives, for the most part, I'm assuming everybody receives their refunds in February or March. And then I'm comparing the time use of those people to other people who were interviewed. Or who were no, not that they received the receipt, but the refund, but they presumably did not receive the refund, and they were interviewed in August or September.
I wonder whether you can define what the vulnerability of eligibility, and then kind of compare those who are in the range of income range, but then who is eligible and against those who are not.
Potentially, I haven't thought about that.
Within the same place, and then you wouldn't have a difference in seasonality.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, ideally, I would like to look at. I mean, one problem with this paradigm is it just looks at short-term effects, right? If you think that having more income has a sustained effect, I'm not capturing that. So if you think it goes beyond April or May, that would be washed out at least. And if you buy a car, hopefully that car is going to last you for a while, more than a month or two, right? So it's going to have longer-term impacts on your commute than something else. And so, as I mentioned, the federal EITC has remained pretty consistent. There's not this exogenous shock or change. It's somewhat of a struggle to look at, to get a causal mechanism. But yeah, I'll think more about that. So as I was saying, I looked at commute time because most families, or many families, spend their refunds on cars. There are no effects on commute. I think part of this is because there's a sustained effect, not a short-term effect. And then I ran 2 falsification tests. So one is by comparing 2 groups of respondents who neither one would be eligible for EITC. So high-income respondents compared to slightly lower but still high-income respondents at tax time versus other months of the year. Now, presumably, many of these high-income individuals are still receiving refunds, right? But it's not this large refund that an EITC refund would be, and some of them may choose to have their withholdings differently, so they may not receive refunds. There's a lot of heterogeneity within these groups about the kinds of influx of income they're getting at tax time. But I don't find any significant interactions, which I would expect. And then I also replaced tax time with various months, including like October and November, months during which families are less likely to receive refunds. And I don't find any interactions which I would hope. But what calls the enrichment and working findings into question are event history analyses. And so I ran the regressions for each month of the year between the treatment and control groups. And these are plotted coefficients, and you can see which ones are significant across the time of year, that basically test whether seasonal variation is driving effects as opposed to the EITC receipt. That if the treatment and control group follow different seasonal variation in their time use, that is subject to bias in our result. Now, for the other dependent variables, I have those event history analyses figures if you want to see them, but those look like I would hope. Here, enriching time with children, there just seems to be different patterns between the treatment and control groups in how they spend enriching time with children. So I don't really trust the effects. Again, like I said, I don't want you to walk away thinking that you give families money and they're spending less time reading to their kids, because I don't think that's really what's going on. I think there's some seasonal variation differences that are driving it. Same thing with working. So presumably EITC recipients are working more low-wage jobs, or they're seasonal, they're shift work, they get some shifts one month and fewer shifts the next month, whereas I think my treatment group is much more stably employed. So I think that's what's driving the work time too. So even the work time effect that was found for parents with young children, I interpret that with caution. It was an exciting effect, but I'm not sure I trust it. Several limitations. I don't observe the EITC receipt, so this is an intent to treat effect, and results may be downwardly biased. There are data limitations. Time use is self-reported, relies on memory. It's also only about the parents, so I can only observe parent-child time use again. The PSAD has a child development supplement that has child level time use that I think would be really interesting to do something like this. My guess of these kinds of results is I think families are spending money on children's experiences that wouldn't be captured with parent-child time, right? I think maybe kids are going to preschool or they're going to soccer camps or lessons, and that's what families are doing with this money as opposed to parent-child interaction necessarily. And that still would improve children's achievement, but not in the same way. There is missing data. About 8% of respondents were missing income, so I couldn't predict their tax liability. As I mentioned, this approach can only look at short-term effects on time use. I would hope that a significant influx of money would have more sustained effects than just immediate. And I think the DD approach is subject to seasonality issues. That the event history analyses for parent-child enriching and working time raise concerns. Why these seasonal variations are different between these different groups of people, I think, is an interesting question in and of itself, but it calls into question the causality of the results. So in summary, there's some evidence that EITC refund receipt is associated with short-term increases in the likelihood of spending any time and in total time with children. And this is particularly true among mothers, unmarried respondents, and unmarried mothers. Although there's also some evidence for decreases in parent-child time among fathers and married respondents. And so this is interesting in terms of the gender gap in child rearing. We already know that mothers do more. It's possible that this short-term increase in income and household resources lead to a widening of this caretaking gap. There's limited evidence that EITC receipt is associated with short-term decreases in the likelihood and the total time enriching time, increases in work time. Again, these should be interpreted with caution. I don't trust those two dependent variables. And I think the bottom line is I think increased income affects children's achievement by increasing resources, such as the quality of housing, of education, of nutrition. Decreases stress in the household. As I mentioned, I don't have an emotional, a measure of emotional valence in the household. And children's own time use. So in future research, I'd like to look at something like the PSAD to see whether children's experiences in their time are affected by these income influxes. But as the ITC expansions are talked about and they're already getting attention in presidential campaigns, they have been talked about across the aisle. Whether there's any action on that is suspect, but it is being debated. I think we need more research on the effects of the ITC and other kinds of similar income shocks on time use in particular. So that's all I have. Thank you.
I apologize for going back to the income shock. When we go down to those 2 bullet points, does income have to be a shock to be of value? In other words, I'm not an economist, I'm a sociologist. You kind of look around and say, well, people know what class they're in, they know a bunch of other things, they kind of know how their lives are rolling out and so on. Income could be valuable for moving people across classes and things like that, but does it have to be a shock? I'm sorry to do this, but I mean, we have become like people from Mars. We talk about things in ways that don't really make sense. Sorry. No. That's why I picked on the economists. But I just think the real question is, would kids be better off if the parents had more money? Not if they were shocked that they had more money.
No, I agree, and I should.
Sorry about that, but I mean, I've been in these. I'm getting out. I've been in these seminars too long.
I shouldn't use the word shock there because I'm using it more as an influx. defined as an influx, not as a surprise. I won the lottery or something, right?
But if you think about it, that's really, the whole causal thing and so on is all predicated on the idea that you're not, you can win Nobel Prizes for coming, literally, I'll name some names in a minute, for coming up with some theories about income inequities. I'm not joking.
No, I believe you. I think.
I'm not joking, people.
In my meetings, we were talking about universal basic income, right? That's not a shock. That's a very stable, predictable effect that has pretty strong effects on child family functioning. Laura?
Yeah, I'm curious to know more. So going back to the original question, which is trying to explain this kind of effect that income can have on educational achievement of the kids, and you mentioned kind of expenditures on out of school experiences, or even, I don't know, like help for the kids to do better on exams and things like that. And I'm just wondering, is there any evidence of that is using, for instance, like consumer expenditure survey, something like that, looking at this? Or even, and I know that the amount here might be too small to produce some effect like that, but we know that parents care a lot about the quality of the school, like are people even moving or considering moving as a result of having extra money and like putting kids into better schools and things like that. Do we know any of those things? Is there research on any of those?
Good question. I mean, I know that like educational quality is as measured by test scores is like very predictive of home values or something. So there's some sort of like value for that. For expenditures, we do know that families are spending much more money on kids than they did in the past, especially those high income kids, and especially before age 6. So high income kids are more likely to be in center-based early education and preschool. They have all these resources basically thrown at them, and that hasn't been the case for low-income kids. So I don't know, but I also, in other research, in another study, I look at the increase in SNAP benefits and food stamp benefits that happened with ARA in the 2009 stimulus package. Increased SNAP benefits by about 16% on average, and I find that kids are much less likely to have delays in needing health care and outstanding mental health and prescription drug needs. So there's evidence that would, and SNAP is, you must spend it on food to be prepared at home, but it frees up other resources to be spent on health care, right? So it's a cash-like infusion. So I do think that families are spending more money when they do have more money on their kids in particular. I mean, we also looked at adult health care outstanding medical needs. We found no effects actually. So parents are spending that money on their kids.
No, I'm thinking there are lots of findings here, and I'm thinking about the political discussion that you mentioned and the connection with work. And that finding and increases in work time among parents with young children. I wonder if it would not be worth to pick up on just the tension between work time and some other time, and just focus on the effect on work. Because we have these opposing messages there. For rich people, we tell them stop working, so spend time with your kids. For poor people, we tell them go and work. And most of the opposition to these programs is that assumption that if you give money to low-income parents, they will stop working. And actually, maybe this should be just about, just do they really stop working? And the no effect is actually a very important effect.
That's a great point. Yeah, I should focus on that, especially because in other kinds of income studies, they do find this depressive effect. That doesn't seem to be happening here. Yeah, that's a really great point.
We're just gonna say there's, I think Sarah Halpern came out with a book last year, a qualitative study on how parents and kids spend their EITC.
Right.
And I think one of the findings was that they use it to finally be able to buy like bigger purchases for their children, like clothes or things that they had not been able to buy all year. And I wonder if, I haven't read the book, but if there are things there that might help you interpret some of the kind of time-use findings in the, yeah. Kind of, I mean, I know that there's a lot of discussion of the economic balance and how it affects that in the household. So it might be really interesting the time-use findings.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, thanks very much.
Thank you.